When it comes to the movie 28 years later, The Bone Temple, I'm going to be honest and say, whilst I do find it to be a weird watch, it's so good nonetheless. Let's get into it. Firstly, I found it intriguing that the tone of this film feels so much different in comparison to its predecessor, especially when it comes to the zombies, which, if anything, I feel like are less of a threat in comparison, especially when the Jimmy Gang are involved, as they treat the zombies in this film as if they are test dummies to practice on. The tone of the story also has changed, no longer feeling like a coming of age story, which I will say I was a bit sad, but I'm also enthralled by. Spike is still the lead character, but he does take the back seat for characters like Sir Lord Jimmy Crystal and Dr. Ian Kessler to take control of the story. One being very dark and dystopian, the other somewhat strange but filled with hope. I felt the tone switches in this film was amazingly done, so effortlessly. Seeing the Jimmy Gang and the edge of your seat horror that they display onto the screens, and then moving on to Dr. Ian Kessler, who is experimenting with the Alpha Samson, and there's a lot of optimism and hope within watching him. And I found this intriguing to see them show the polar opposites of an apocalypse, with one being in total chaos, but the other with curiosity and hope. Now, the film still has its violence and it's as grotesque as ever, but it's not coming from the rage monsters as much as it is in the previous film, and more coming from the humans, especially with the satanic cult that Jimmy is leading to commit such atrocious acts. And what's really intriguing is it's no longer this visual beauty that we got in the previous film that has that visualization of looking quite cool. Instead, it is gut-wrenching, it is stomach-turning, and I think that's a very clever and riveting way of showing violence, that it's not this thing to gloss over from a visual perspective. No, it's supposed to make you feel sick, disturbed, if anything, and they executed that very well. The film has a lot of humour, especially when it comes to Ralph Fiennes' character, as we see him experimenting with this Alpha Samson that we see in the previous film, and we see him doing a lot of weird dancey type shit and stuff that you kind of question, if I'm being genuinely honest. But there's humour nonetheless, and it's in bounds in comparison to the previous film. Now, that's not to say it didn't have humour, it's just in dribs and drabs in comparison. The humour in this film was used amazingly well to lower the tone of this film, especially when we are coming from quite a horrific scene with the Jimmy Gang, and they use this well to lower it, but also it can be used as a way as the calm before the storm when having to return to the gang, and this was something they masterfully did throughout the film, which needs to be talked about. The film has what I would call odd or questionable behaviour from the character of Dr. Kessler, that being with his treatment of Samson, as we see him somewhat drugging him and then dancing with him, and some would just chalk it up to being funny and a bit odd and question his sanity in this world. But I look at it a bit more deeply and go above and beyond face value and see it that he is optimistic, because he sees that instead of him running at him and try and rip him limb from limb, there's a calming approach to Samson. So when he drugs him again, we're seeing that calming effect become more and more, and there's a form of optimism with the Doctor. But also you can look at it as this is a man so deprived of company in the last 20 years or so that he is willing to hang out with a human who's filled with this rage virus to the point that he could rip them limb from limb, all just for a little bit of company. And you can somewhat feel a bit sad for the character. There's a bit of sympathy for him. Now, when it comes to the third act of this film, I will say that is when they turn it up a notch. We're having to see a character having to put on a performance that is so mesmerizing, otherwise they are going to lose their life, and you literally feel like he is dancing and putting on this performance as if this is his last day, and he does an excellent job of doing said performance. And it's really the only time you see a gig in a zombie universe, which is quite remarkable, I will say. Sadly, things do go a bit awry, and characters we grow to love in this film are sadly injured, but good does prevail. Now, when it comes to the end of this film, I found it to be intriguing, and I really want to see how they conclude the 28 years later trilogy if they actually get the opportunity to do that, of course. Now, when it comes to criticisms, I do have a few. Firstly, is towards the soundtrack of this film, as I loved the previous soundtrack in 28 Years Later. It was one of the highlights for me, and when going into this film I had such high expectations for the instrumentals to be just as hooking as the previous ones, and maybe even hear them again. Sadly, they used more commercial songs like Girls on Film by Duran Duran and other sorts of songs like that, which I felt a bit disappointed, but I understand from the plot development, but from background instrumentals I didn't get the satisfaction I was hoping for. And while the third act, when the way they used music with commercial songs was fantastically well, overall as a film, instrumentally, I felt very disappointed. I don't think they did as good as instrumentals as they did in the first film. And then my second critique is about the third act itself, which I still think is a fantastic element of the film. I would not change it one bit. But there is a glaring mistake in that film, as we see music and visuals being on 11 at this point, and we do not see any zombies even running or approaching at this point, which baffles me, as we got loud music playing, we got huge visuals for everyone to see in around the town. You'd kind of think that would draw them in, but alas, we do not see that. Well, I just found that quite strange and quite an error on their part. But overall, I really did enjoy this film, and while I wasn't expecting the weirdness from Ralph Fiennes' character, I enjoyed it nonetheless. I really enjoyed indulging in the Jimmy Gang and what the hell they got up to, and whilst I will say there are some elements of this film that I was disappointed by, that I think the first film did really well, I still think this is a great film and a decent sequel. Is this good? I'm going to be honest and say no, it's great. Rating wise, I'm going to say 8 out of 10. Now, when it comes to would I rewatch it, the answer's plain and simple, and that is yes. I thought this was a fantastic film, not only for everything I've said, but also I think the performances were very outstanding, and I really think people need to be awarded for that. Now, when it comes to recommendations, of course I'm going to recommend all the 28 films regardless of opinion. They're all good in their own way. But we're going to talk about another franchise which involves cults and so forth, that being The Walking Dead. As through seasons 1 to, well, whenever it continues, you see all these type of cults, whether it being the good type to the disturbed type. You can see a lot of similarities in said cults with what we see in this. When it comes to others, I would say Ralph Fiennes. Most know him as Voldemort, and he did a great performance in that, but the one film I want to recommend is the film The Menu. It is a great film. It is about a chef who's planning to cook his last meal, and it's quite a psychological horror mixed with comedy, so if you like horror and food, I definitely recommend it. The next is Jack O'Connell, who I think, again, brilliant performance in the film Sinners. Regardless of my feelings of that film, I can always still say that he did an excellent job in that film. Not only that, but like many British people, were introduced to him through the TV show Skins, and he was one of the main hooking factors of seasons 3 and 4, as he was quite a chaotic and unpredictable character. Not only that, but in season 7 he stole the show again, being in 2 episodes about just him and his character, and honestly he was the hooking point of season 7, as it dove into individual characters, and honestly his episodes are the best. Those are my recommendations. This has been my review for 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. If you have enjoyed, please like and subscribe, but most importantly, thank you and have a nice day.